Keeping your skills up to date has never been so important, and in this video I'm going to take you through everything that you need to know in order to get you up and running in Azure Active Directory, and it's right up to date for May 2023. So are you ready? Greetings my fellow YouTubers and welcome to Slovenia. As you've noticed, I'm not in my regular studio this week, I'm actually on vacation. But I want to talk to you about Azure Active Directory, and I realized, about a year ago I did a video on getting started and a lot has changed in Azure AD over that 12-month period. Microsoft Entra has now become the kind of overriding brand to Microsoft's identity platform. And I really wanted to take you through everything that you needed to know in order to get you up and running. And I'm going to try and do it, of course, as my usual, in less than 30 minutes. Now, if you've got questions and comments about this, or in fact any of my other sessions, then of course, just get them down below and I'll do my very best to answer those questions for you. And of course, if you've not subscribed, well, we love subscribers. So bump that subscribe button up there, ring that bell, and you'll be notified of any new postings and videos that I have. All right, so I think without any further ado, let's jump in. We'll talk about some of the basics of Azure AD, kind of what is it, how it works, and then I've got some nice demos for you. So first up then, the theory part. So taking a look at Active Directory versus Azure Active Directory. I suppose this all started back in 2000 when Microsoft developed its first version of Active Directory. It's a database, and within the database, you could store items in what we call organizational units. And this often represented your organizational structure, it could be location and such. Alternatively, within there, of course, you could then create objects, such as user objects, group objects, and device objects. And of course, an object had attributes, such as your first name, last name, email address, and so on. And the key thing to note about Active Directory was that you were responsible for maintaining everything. So I suppose if you wanted a really good analogy, it would be a house. So here is your average regular home. And with a home, you are responsible for the mortgage, you're responsible for the maintenance of the house, you're responsible for all the utilities. So when we come to identity as a service, we then look at something called Azure Active Directory. And Azure Active Directory is hosted in one of Microsoft's enormous data centers. And think of a data center like a modern hotel, and you can compare that to a data center here. Now, within that data center, or in our hotel, of course, you're going to have people who look after everything or every aspect of the business. In other words, you pay a subscription and these nice people look after your every requirements. So everything from the reception to creating accounts to looking after guests to security and everything. Now, the key thing is as long as you pay your subscription, you don't need to worry about, for example, the upkeep of the hotel or any kind of additional costs. And we can compare that here into a Microsoft data center. So these data centers, again, you pay your subscription and Microsoft take care of the infrastructure, the platform, and of course, the software as a service. So in our data center here, you can see that we have Azure Active Directory, and it is indeed identity as a service. So in this case, everything is hosted throughout Microsoft's huge data center infrastructure, which is dispersed throughout the world. And as I've mentioned, you are responsible for your own tenant. And within your tenant, you create your user objects, your groups, and you can also add and manage your devices as well. Now, within the data center, of course, Microsoft have their responsibilities. So as long as you pay your subscription, they are responsible for not only the maintenance of the data center, but also ensuring that your data is well protected and secured. Now, in addition, of course, you are responsible for managing the user objects, and these can include the different attributes, so first name, last name, email address, and so on. Of course, identity is the key to everything, and essentially a tenant is a gateway to many other services that are running within the cloud. And this can include, of course, other cloud providers such as Google and Amazon and so on. Now, one of the key things, of course, likewise, when you check into a hotel, you may need to authenticate yourself. So, for example, do you have a booking reference number? And in some cases, they may ask to see your passport. And again, the same thing is exactly the same for when you authenticate into the cloud. Now, traditional authentication used to use something called, or legacy is something that you know, and this can include a username and a password, and this is kind of very much on its way out now. If you're using Windows, then you can use technologies like Windows Hello for Business. Again, this can include things like facial recognition, fingerprint, and so on. In addition, you can also, not only something that you have, so it might be a token, you might also be using the Microsoft Authenticator app on your phone, but it can also be based on somewhere where you are as well. So, for example, one of the features that Azure provides is something called conditional access. And if you've not learned about that, then definitely check out one of my videos on my channel on that. So, and you can combine all of these elements to form something called multi-factor authentication. In other words, you need multiple tools or multiple methods in order to authenticate. And this is by far one of the safest ways to authenticate yourselves in the cloud. So that being the details, I think it's about time we had a look at Azure Active Directory, and let's get you started. So getting started in Microsoft Azure AD or Microsoft 365 is super simple. Simply go to azure.microsoft.com and you can try Azure for free. Here you'll need to create a subscription, and that subscription will require a credit card. But don't worry, you're not going to be billed. It's just used for identity purposes. So with this, you'll basically get 30 days free trial. Okay. Now, in addition, or alternatively, you can also go to Microsoft 365 or office.com and you can get Microsoft 365. Please note as well, there is also a free version of Microsoft 365, although I must warn you, it's very, very limited. And certainly if you want to study Microsoft 365, i.e. the technical aspects of it, then this would not be for you. Okay. Now, once you're up and running and you have created an account, this at the same time also creates something called a tenant. So here I'm in Microsoft 365, and I'll just make that a little bit bigger here. And if you've got Microsoft 365, you'll be very familiar with it, I'm sure. You get all the various apps here. Now, one app that I do have, of course, is I'm an administrator, so I get access to the various admin tools here. So the admin tools will give me access to a number of portals. So really just looking at the basic things that you get, and then we're going to jump into Azure Active Directory. So first up then we have the office.com account here, and you can see that I get my generic admin tools here, which can include creating users and groups, managing administrator roles, and dealing with my various resources. Now, depending on your role, your admin role in the organization, you may also get access to other portals as well. So, for example, security, compliance, Microsoft Exchange if you're managing email and communications, and also things like SharePoint and Teams. Now, the super user account in Microsoft 365 and in Azure AD is an account called the global admin. Now, when you create your tenant for the first time, you will become the global admin. Now, I want to create and manage user accounts, group accounts, and so on. And I mentioned for this, we use a tool called Azure Active Directory. And I'm going to click into this. Now, you'll remember that I also mentioned that Azure Active Directory forms part of something called Microsoft Entra. So Microsoft have recently done quite a bit of rebranding, actually. So now in Microsoft 365, for example, security now comes under the Microsoft Defender brand, and their compliance tools come under the Microsoft Purview brand. So here in Microsoft Azure Active Directory, you can see that in Microsoft Entra, we have a number of different tools. And specifically today, I'm going to focus on this. This is my Azure Active Directory. Now, I mentioned that we're in our hotel, and I've got my room that I'm paying my subscription for, and this is my tenant. And this gives me details about my tenant here. It tells me what kind of license that I have for my tenancy. Now, please note that there are a number of different license types. There's even a free version of Azure AD, and then there are some premium versions as well. So there is an Office Apps version or an E3, which gives you access to most features in Microsoft 365 and in Azure AD. But if you want some of the really improved security features, multi-factor authentication, identity protection, you will need a P1 and a P2 license. Certainly conditional access requires a P1. But as I say, don't worry. The fact that you've gone ahead, you've signed up for that 30-day trial, this is a great way to actually learn. Now, just one quick tip here. As I mentioned, you can go into either office.com or azure.com and create those free accounts. Just to say that if you're going into Azure, a good tip would be to create a free Outlook account. Now, the reason for that is you can only create one account per email address that you use. So if you want to create and work with multiple accounts, go ahead and create a different Outlook.com account for each Azure subscription. And that's a great way to learn and keep learning as well. All right. So heading back here, then let's take a look now at the basics of Azure Active Directory. So Azure Active Directory here, you can see this is where I can create my users, my groups, manage my devices. I can also go into protect and secure. There's an option there. I can manage things like roles and groups and managing admins. I want to look at the basics today. So with this, I want to talk about users. So users, I'm going to come into my users. I've got all users and I've got deleted users here. Now, I'm often asked, Andy, what's the best way to create a user account? Some people create them in Microsoft 365. And if I go into Microsoft 365 here, indeed, if I go into users, you've also got active users here. Now, one thing to note is they're exactly the same users, all right? And I'm often asked, Andy, which is the best portal to use? Do I use Azure AD or do I use Microsoft 365? I have to be honest with you. There is no one portal to rule them all here. So it's really what works for you. Now, there are going to be things that you can only do in Azure AD, and there are only things that you can do in Microsoft 365. I know it's a little bit confusing, but believe me, you'll get the hang of it. Okay. So with that, the first thing we're going to need to do is we're going to need to create a user account, of course. Now, there are two types of user that you can create in Azure AD. One is called just a regular user, and this is a licensed user in your tenant. Alternatively, you can also invite an external user as well. Now, depending on the license that you have for Azure or 365, you have to have a certain number of users before you can invite lots of guests, of course, and it tends to work out a 5-to-1 ratio. So for every 5 user accounts, you can have a single guest. Although Microsoft are constantly reviewing that, by the way. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a user account, and it's asking me for what we call a UPN, a user principal name. Now, a user principal name is essentially an email address. And you can see here that it's generated a tenant address for me in the format of tenant.onmicrosoft.com. So this is Microsoft's internal domain name, and this is our tenant or folder name or room number, depending on how you want to do it. And to be honest, this doesn't really matter. If you've got your own domain name, you can actually go ahead and register your own domain name. And if you've not seen how to do that, by the way, then check out my video on DNS on my YouTube channel. I'll put the link in below, by the way. So in this case, I'm going to create a user here. I'm a big Star Trek fan, as everybody knows. So I'm going to call this Picard J. And I'm going to call him Jean-Luc Picard. Okay, so I'm going to put in here Jean-Luc Picard. I'm going to auto-generate a password for this user, and you can see I've enabled the password. Now, if you're not ready for that account to be enabled, of course, I can take that checkbox out there. Now, I'm going to click on Next, and it says, okay, what's the user's name? Well, in this case, it's Jean-Luc, of course, and the last name is Jean-Luc Picard. And you can see it's asking what kind of user account is this. Now, as I said, you've got 2 types of user account. You can have a member, so he's a member of your tenant, or he's an invite. So again, this might be somebody outside your organization. It might be a supplier, a customer, or somebody like that you want to invite in to collaborate. Again, you can give him a job title. I can give him some company information. I'll say Jean-Luc's in sales here. If you're using a HR system, then that HR system can integrate with Azure Active Directory. And you can see it can fill details in here. Again, I can put in a city as well. So, for example, I live in Scotland. So I'm going to say Jean-Luc lives in Edinburgh. And again, I can put some details in for Jean-Luc here. I can type in, do I want to create an email address for him yet? Again, not yet. So first of all, Andy, why doesn't it create an email address? Because I haven't licensed this user yet. Okay, you've also got various other fields there that you could go in and fill in. Now, do I want to make Jean-Luc a member of a group? Or you've got 3 options here. Do you want to add him to an admin role? So do I want to make him an administrator of any kind? Do I want to add him to a group so I can set permissions? Or do I want to add him to something called an administrative unit? So, for example, let's say you're based in London and you are an administrator in London, then I can add Jean-Luc into this administrative unit and you can then manage him. Next, I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to review, and I'm going to go ahead and create this account here. So there we go. I have now created Jean-Luc's account, but of course his account has not been licensed yet. So I can simply go back into here. I'll just refresh this page. And within here, I'm just going to scroll right down. And sure enough, you can see I've got Jean-Luc Picard here. Now, in Azure Active Directory, I get lots and lots of detail about the user account. So things like groups that he's a member of, any applications that he's been assigned, and of course, licenses. So the next thing then is assigning a license. And again, you can select the licenses that you want to go through. Alternatively, you can review the different license options. So for example, I can say, yeah, I want to look at the enterprise mobility and security. I can assign different licenses from here. The other thing that I could also do, by the way, is I can also come into Microsoft 365. And again, if I just refresh this page, you can do exactly the same thing from here as well. So I'm going to click onto Jean-Luc's account. I'm going to click into his account here. I'm going to go into licenses and apps. And this is now where I start assigning some licenses. So I'm going to give him a Windows license, an E5 license. Okay, so now that I've gone ahead and assigned that, you can now see that Jean-Luc has now been fully licensed. Okay, for the next section, I want to talk a little bit about groups. Groups are super important. Now, once you've created your account and you've licensed your account, the next thing you're going to think about is what the account is for. Are you going to use the account for collaboration? Is it security? Are you going to assign permissions and so on? For this demo, I'm going to come into the Microsoft 365 Admin Center here, and we've looked at user accounts. Now, what I've done here, just to save a little bit of time, as I said, I've created a couple of users. So I've created a user called Jean-Luc Picard, and I've also created, of course, you can't have Jean-Luc Picard without creating an account for William Riker as well. Now, one of the differences that sets apart Microsoft 365 to Azure Active Directory is the fact that when you create groups, there are a number of little kind of differences. So I can come into groups here, for example, in Azure, and if I create a new group, then basically here there are two types of group. So you can create a security group, or you can create a Microsoft 365 group. So think about the Microsoft 365 group as a fully collaborative group. Now, as I said, you've only got the two options here. But if I do the same thing, let's just come out of that. If I do the same thing in Microsoft 365, you'll see here that because we have Microsoft Exchange, Microsoft Teams, of course, SharePoint are all parts of Microsoft 365, groups here are handled slightly different. So we have security groups, mail-enabled security groups, a distribution list, and a Microsoft 365 group. And essentially, it's all to do with the amount of collaboration that you want to place within the group. So, for example, a security group can contain either users or devices, such as laptops, computers, and so on. And you can then assign permissions to those devices or to the users. A mail-enabled security group is essentially a security group with a distribution list, a contact list. So it's not actually got a mailbox, it's just mail-enabled. A distribution list, of course, is just a contact list, nothing more. And finally, a Microsoft 365 group is a fully collaborative group. So in this case, let's create a group here. So I'm going to create two types of group. I'll create a Microsoft 365 group for you. And I'm going to click next. And this group, I'm going to call this, I will call this my sales team. Okay. So in fact, let's give it a location. I'm based in Edinburgh. So I'm going to call this my Edinburgh sales. So within my Edinburgh sales, I can put in a description. I can click next. And very importantly, I can go ahead and I can assign an owner to the group. Now, for the purpose of this demo, I'm going to use Adele here. I'm going to say Adele can be the owner. And this is a special permission that this group has. And what she can do, she has the rights to assign other members to that group. And again, I'm going to click next. Now, I'm going to add a member. So again, a couple of ways that you can add members. You can either directly add members in, or you can use something called a dynamic rule, which I'll show you in a moment. So for the purpose of this demo, of course, I'm going to scroll down. We'll bring in Jean-Luc, we'll bring in Joanna. Let's bring in, who do we have? We've got William Riker. I'm going to scroll up and let's bring in Alex as well. So I'm going to add in those members to my group. Members, by the way, typically have the permissions of contributing to the group. So again, think about, it's all about collaboration. So the group email address, you can really put anything that you like in here if you like. So I'm going to put in, I'll say Edinburgh Sales. And you can see after a moment, it gives it a little tick and it says, yes, this is absolutely fine. Now, one of the things you can also put on the group is a sensitivity label. So how confidential or how sensitive is the group? So for the purpose of this demo, I'm just going to ignore that. The next thing then is privacy. Now, because it's the default here is a public group, and I'll show you what that means in a second, but essentially there are two things. So one, it can be discoverable. So in other words, anyone can create a group in Microsoft 365. So groups can also be created within Outlook. So I can simply go into Outlook here, and if I scroll down, you can see I've got groups, and I can go ahead and I can create groups if I have the rights to do so. So particularly useful for collaboration. So if you make a group public, it's not only discoverable by anyone, but anybody can also join it as well. Just take that into account when you create that group. So as an alternative, of course, you can make a group private. So when you make a group private, again, one of the options that you have is you can, or in fact, it doesn't matter whether it's private or public actually, but one of the options that you have is, do you want to extend the capabilities of the team or of the group to become a Microsoft team? Now, if you decide, I'm not sure about that, you can take the checkbox out there. And again, you can add it later though, so don't worry. Another thing that you can also do is you can basically align this group to become a member of an admin role. So for example, if you wanted, let's say, anybody who's a member of this group, they can be an Exchange admin or something like that. So I'm now going to click on Next, and I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to create my group, and you can see I'll just click on Close. Yes, there we go. So you can see Edinburgh Sales. Now in this screen here, you can see who created the group, you can see the email, you can see if the group is a Microsoft team. Now what do I mean by that? Well, if I come into, let's have a look at some of these groups. What is a Microsoft 365 group? Well, as I mentioned, it's a fully collaborative group. So not only does it get its own mailbox, shared mailbox, but it also has its own document library as well. So document libraries are great for shared documents. And the other thing, you've also got a shared calendar, you get a shared website, planner, notebook, and so on. But the key thing is it just contains Microsoft apps. Now, if I come into Edinburgh Sales, and if I go into my settings page here, one of the options that I have, or as I should say in general here, is this one. It says, do you want to extend the group to become a Microsoft team? Now, just to remind you that this is an irreversible action. So if you click onto this, you can't then change your mind. But what this does do is it extends the capability in Microsoft Teams, and you can now do chats with the group, and you can also use third-party apps. So this is a really nice feature. Okay, and there we go. That's how you can create a Microsoft 365 group and extend it to become a Microsoft team in 365. So what was the other way to add members to a group then? Well, if I come into, let's say coming back into Azure here, I'm going to come into groups, and this time I'm going to create a new group. But instead of creating a security group, again, I'll do a Microsoft 365 group. But this time, I am going to call the group Edinburgh IT Support. Okay. And in here, I'm going to say AD roles. Can AD roles be assigned? So I'm going to say yes, they can be assigned. Now, just to note here, you've got an option here that says, do you want to assign users to the group, or do you want to use something called dynamic users? And dynamic users, I love this, by the way. This is so cool. I won't bother with the sensitivity label. Again, I can assign an owner, but instead of assigning members to the group, check it out. You can do what we call a dynamic query. So I can simply choose a property. So let's say city, let's say equals, and let's say Edinburgh. Okay. And I can add another rule that says, and we can say department equals IT support. All right. And that is my dynamic rule. So basically, if any user has a property where they're in Edinburgh and the department is IT support, they will then automatically be a member of this group. So what I'm going to now do is I'm now going to go back into my users, and I'm going to scroll down, and I've got my user here. Let me just scroll down. I have got, let's say, William Riker. So I'm going to go into Will's account, and I'm going to edit his properties. And of course, in here, I'm going to scroll down, and department, I'm going to say IT support. And of course, I can scroll down. The city he's currently in is Edinburgh. Now, if any of those values change, he will no longer be a member of the group. So if he moves to Glasgow or London, you see how cool that is? That is such a powerful feature. And those are the two ways that you can add members to groups in not only Azure Active Directory, but also Microsoft 365. So the final topic that I'd like to discuss in this Getting Started video is the topic of admins. Now, as I mentioned, when you create a tenant, you create what we call a global administrator. And essentially, the global administrator has the overall responsibility for the tenant. Now, as you can imagine, though, if you are a large organization and you had maybe 10 or 20 different administrators, you don't particularly want all of those people to have global admin rights. It kind of would make things quite complicated. So to make things a little bit easier, I can come into Microsoft 365 and I've got role assignments. Now, please note that you also have something similar in Azure Active Directory. So again, if I come into Azure AD, roles and admins, again, you'll get exactly the same thing here. And the nice thing about this is there are different roles for different duties within the organization. Now, when you first look at this, it does feel a little bit overwhelming, but don't try to resist that kind of, panic. I can feel the panic in your eyes. Don't worry too much about it, because it's not so bad as it looks. So actually, as you start to scroll down through the various roles, you can actually see that they're grouped together. So in this example here, you can see that we have an exchange administrator. So Exchange is the communications, it's Microsoft email, it's all the email system. So you might have, let's say, an administrator who specializes in Microsoft Exchange, and likewise you might have an administrator who is just responsible for licenses or for networks and so on. So some roles, as you can see here, such as Teams, for example, have multiple admin roles. And if you think about Microsoft Teams as an enterprise collaboration platform, it's huge. So, for example, you might have somebody who specializes in the communications part of Teams, so the voice sections. You might have a junior administrator who's responsible for putting Teams phones on people's desks. Get the idea? We also have other roles as well. So if I wanted to, for example, grant my assistant the right to be able to create user accounts and manage licenses, and I don't want them to be a global administrator, I could make them a member of the user admin role. So that's the purpose of this. Now, you can, as I said, you can assign users the different roles in a number of different ways. So if I come into, let's say, active users here, when you create that user account, one of the things that you can do, for example, if I come down to Will Riker here, if I go into Will's account properties, so one of the things that you can do is if I just scroll down, you can see it says at the moment he has no administrator access. Now, I think, Will's been doing a good job. He needs a bit of a promotion. So I want to give him admin center access. But you might not want him to be a global administrator. I want him to be a user administrator. Of course, you can also make him multiple roles as well if you want to. Okay, so it's as simple as that. Now, this basically, you should know, this grants the user permanent access as an administrator. Now, if you don't want that, you can use something called privileged identity management for that. And I've covered that on an alternate video. So definitely go ahead in my identity playlist and check that out. So for the moment, though, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to save that. And you can now see, if I go back to Will's account, just let this refresh, you can now see that Will is now a user administrator and he has all the rights and privileges to carry out that job. So there you have it, all you need to know in just under 30 minutes about Azure Active Directory. Isn't that cool? Now, of course, if you enjoyed the session, bump that like button up there. It really does make a difference. And of course, if you've not subscribed, again, hit that subscribe button, ring the bell, and you'll be notified of any new videos and postings that I have. In the meantime, comments, questions, as always, get those down below, and I'll do my best to answer them for you. And that's it for today. Thanks very much for joining me, and from Slovenia, goodbye. Hey, thanks so much for dropping by today. Here's a couple of videos that you may enjoy, and while you're here, go ahead, click on the subscribe button and you won't miss out.